Hello and welcome to a new episode of Böll Talks, dialogue and insight from Southeast Asia, curated by the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung. I'm Franzi, your host, and in this video series, we will bring together voices and perspective from across the Southeast Asian region, those who are working towards more sustainable, just, and inclusive future. We explore ideas that connect people and the Southeast Asia region, from climate resilience to green innovation, from ecological wisdom to sustainability, from gender equity to democracy and human rights. Each conversation is an invitation to reflect on where we are, what is changing, and how we can move forward together. In this episode, I'm talking to Prof. Dr. Cleo Anne Calimbahin from the Department of Political Science and Development Studies, de la Salle University, Manila, the Philippines, and she's also a senior research fellow at the ANU Philippines Institute, Australia National University in Canberra, Australia. We will talk about her recent paper, Participatory Democracy in a Time of Democratic Backsliding, Populism, and Polarization. So, welcome, Doc Cleo. Can you introduce yourself, your position, your background, and maybe a bit background in the sense that share what first motivated you when you were a student to study, to work on comparative politics, election, and democratization. Why it came to your interest?
I am currently a full professor at the Department of Political Science at the De La Salle University in Manila, and I'm also a senior research fellow at the Australia National University Philippines Institute. I think what got me interested in comparative politics was living in countries that went through dictatorships. So that would be the Philippines and Indonesia, because my father was posted in Indonesia for work, and we were in fact in Jakarta when the People Power Revolution in the Philippines happened. And so on the one hand, we were trying to get news about the Philippines through shortwave radio, because the media at the time was highly censored in Indonesia. So when People Power revolution happened in the Philippines, which is the peaceful revolution that toppled the Marcos Sr. dictatorship, we also saw afterwards how the print media, the foreign print media that we were subscribing to, English newspapers published from different parts of the world, would be heavily redacted. So I think maybe that got my interest into Southeast Asia politics.
Okay, so you really had this personal experience in the past when during your formation years, you were based in Jakarta, and you hear that your country had this populism, democratic backsliding. So this is really fit with our topic today, and also about your paper, right? Because I also recommend the audience to download this paper and read, because it covers case studies from the region about the topic. Dr. Cleo, could you share some insight into the paper we are discussing today? What, to your understanding, are the major takeaways, like why people could benefit from reading your papers? What did you cover in this paper?
So I think one of the first things I wanted to establish was the kind of political environment that we are in, that we're seeing in the region, levels of democratic decline. We're seeing manifestations of polarization, and we're seeing support for populism as well. At the same time, it's also to look back at the rich history of participatory democracy in Southeast Asia that has a rich history of pushing back against shrinking democratic spaces over time, and also to be wary of things that might pose challenges to having meaningful participatory democracy in Southeast Asia.
And in our region in Southeast Asia, majority of the people take politics for granted, right? So they sometimes reduce politics just to about election, whom to vote, whose family is powerful, or whose family belongs to my or has close proximity to what I believe, right? So does this kind of participatory democracy is still immature in Southeast Asia then, because people tend to reduce it only to election?
Right. So that is part of the problem, that participatory democracy tends to be limited only to elections. And that's just one part of the story in terms of living and breathing democracy. One needs to go beyond participation in election, but really participating at the different levels of and avenues where one can participate as a citizen. Empowered citizens can fight back against entitled politicians, and and that's important in Southeast Asia. So we need to be cognizant of the many opportunities that we can still find, even though there's a shrinking democratic space. We see that in many countries. Very recently, we saw this with the kinds of anger that the public manifested over corruption issues, both in the Philippines and Indonesia. We've seen that also over time in Malaysia and in Thailand. But the avenues for pushback are very, very different in all these countries as well.
Then in your paper, you mention different forms of democracy or democratic participation that we see now in Southeast Asia today. Could you kind of share, illustrate, because our region also has kind of post-colonial context, right? Some people would say that we learn the concept of democracy from the Western sphere of the world. So could you maybe just mention some example? Don't give out too much, because I want also people to read by themselves and interpret by themselves. But what kind of different form of democracy that exists or we see in Southeast Asia today?
Well, there's a lot of emphasis on the procedural democracy, right? So even though these uh, individuals who proffer themselves to lead countries would claim that they are democratic, they are really just focusing on the procedural aspect of democracy. But we're also seeing limited participatory processes for the public, for the citizens. So in some countries where you used to have bottom-up budgeting, suddenly that would be scrapped. But that was a very meaningful way to participate, right? Access to good information, not disinformation or misinformation, that's important. And so sometimes we can see that there's deliberate misinformation or disinformation. So that's also contributing to the kind of issues and challenges we face in countries that are purportedly democratic. Campaign finance or money politics is an issue. It's very expensive to be able to run for public office in some countries. And so incumbency will always have advantage. Or in the case of the Philippines, we saw that those who challenge incumbents are contractors of public works. So they're still after the same thing, which is access to state resources. I think also, if you think about it, there are increasing influence of men in uniform in Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned, issues of disinformation and misinformation, especially in the digital space, is problematic in terms of how the public can genuinely participate in various democratic processes.
Thank you. And you mentioned some countries in our region that experiencing this wave, it's almost like during the pandemic, right? The wave goes from one country to another country. And also in this era of, let's say, free information, people can access information from the palm of their hands, right? And also new generation, they are more fluent in technology. how would you explain the current wave of democratic backsliding in Southeast Asia? And what signs, maybe you can kind of identify two or three signs that worry you the most about this democratic backsliding?
Mhm. I think we're seeing something drives an attraction to populism. We're seeing an attraction to authoritarianism, and that came out in some surveys. Even though there are other surveys that also show that there is an attraction for democratic attitudes, but that is also countered by levels of skepticism by the public, and that skepticism, it's not a justification, but it's due to a failure of democratic institutions as well to deliver uh, efficiently and effectively public services. So, given the protracted nature of inequality that we're seeing in various parts of the region, I think there are some sectors of society who would like to see quick solutions to these very, very long-standing problems of inequality. And populists and their rhetoric and authoritarian rulers tend to be very convincing that they can deliver those very quick fixes to long-term problems, and so that's very attractive.
And you mentioned about the signs, you mentioned about the current wave to democratic backsliding. In your paper, also you mentioned about populism and authoritarianism has reshaped people' expectation of leadership. Just what you just said, right? Why people stop believing in democratic institution? You know, they're looking for this quick fix. They look for the strong man. They look for someone who can kind of revive the glory of the past. Just a wild thought. Was it also because of the post-pandemic situation of the world, right? A lot of people crashed, a lot of country crashed, then they tried to rebuild. And on top of that, wars, conflict everywhere, in also in our region. ASEAN, peaceful region, suddenly you have very strong border conflict in some countries. So, in what way, populism and authoritarianism reshape people's expectation of leadership? Why people, let's say, fall in love again with this strong men or strong leaders?
Well, I think if we look at how political elites behave, you can see that they will really take advantage of economic, social, and political cleavages that exist so that they can gain support and mobilize support for their own purposes. So I think, as you said, all those conditions contributed to some political elites to really emphasize differences rather than similarities, emphasize grievances, and propose very quick fixes to the detriment of some democratic values and norms.
And how this, let's say, the appetite for populism and authoritarianism impact the democratic processes in the region? Is it going in negative trends, or there could be kind of a fix later when people realize that this doesn't work? It happened in the past, it crashed, and then now we repeat the history again. How this expectation impacted democratic processes in the region?
Well, I think when the region is facing issues of polarization, when the region is facing issues of populism or authoritarian tendencies, I think we have to again try to understand where the public's coming from, why that is attractive. Now, the pushback for that is, what are the kinds of participation that we can encourage? Because sooner or sooner or later, it will be obvious when there's too much entitlement, when there's too much impunity. The public sees that, right? The public sees that, and that's what we're seeing when we're seeing political mobilization against corruption. It has erupted because people can see that there's this impunity for those in power. So I think it's important that we also remind the public that it's our duty to hold public officials accountable, and holding them accountable not just through elections, which is a type of vertical accountability, but we also have to demand that the kind of accountability between and among government agencies and branches of government happen. So we need to see them functioning and fulfilling their mandate of providing oversight to other institutions. So those are some of the things that we can emphasize in terms of participation, is that accountability matters, and we need to demand for accountability.
Thank you. You said a few bits about polarization. Polarization itself is often seen as a symptom rather than a cause. So if there's a polarization that something is not, or let's say the democracy is not healthy, like a flu. Do you think that social and political divides today are fundamentally changing how citizens view democracy? Or could be this is just temporary, there's still hope?
I think we have to be responsive to the changing nature of relationship between state and society, because now the digital space really plays a role, and it's very easy to promote misinformation and disinformation, and that shapes preferences, and that preferences can also latch on to the kinds of cleavages that are exploited by those in power. So that level of combination drives polarization in the region, and we're seeing it not just in the region but outside of the region. So I think what's important for effective participation and mobilization is to address some of those things. So there needs to be a pushback as well in the digital space when it comes to these things. And it's not enough to have fact checking. It's really to make digital literacy and critical evaluations of material online that we need to foster among our citizens. Now, given that Southeast Asia has a very young population, so it makes me very hopeful, because they're digital natives, that they'll be able to flag more quickly messages that are ripe with disinformation or inaccuracies. But having said that, it's hard for us, for instance, in the Philippines, to talk about the youth vote. It's hard for us to really measure some of these participation in terms of generational differences or the generational participation of citizens.
Academic institution and civil society organization has long been the engines of participatory democracy. In your view, what are the, let's say, current obstacles and opportunities that they face in an era of shrinking civic space and rising disinformation?
Yes, unfortunately, when the democratic space shrinks, that's usually because of repressive tactics. and media, academic institutions, activists experience that. Even threats to individuals who are officials of courts can also be threatened, right? And in the region, we've seen a history of that, of threats to individuals who have tasks to demand accountability, whether they are judicial courts, media, activists, and academics. And yes, it's very sad when you have to self-censor yourself. It's very sad when you have to think of your think of your welfare when you would like to voice out demands for accountability, which should be part of the democratic arena. And that's a challenge. So that's a challenge. But the opportunities are that for those in civil society and also academics, if they are active in some cause, right? We have to think of creative new ways to mobilize support. Some of the things that worked before historically are good, it's there, but maybe we need to pivot or be quick as well to identify opportunities where we can have a broader coalition or gain new members or enlighten people about the kinds of responsibilities they have in a democratic space. I think it's also part of the challenge is well, it's a threat and an opportunity, right? Because the digital space is so wide, but you also don't have a clear direction where that will go. And influencers are there, yes, but you can have influencers on both sides, and that drives polarization. So I think people have to be wary of that. At the same time, I'm quite hopeful that young people will find ways to reach and organize through the many avenues that they have, both face to face on and online. So I think there's a lot of possibilities that in terms of getting people to mobilize and get together. We've seen this during the pandemic, right? There was in the region that there was a limitation of how to get together and mobilize. But some countries in Southeast Asia were able to do that by being very quick to use digital platforms to mobilize and outwit authorities that might want to clamp down on their mobilization.
Thank you. I agree with your remarks, especially the younger generation, Gen Z, Alpha, these digital natives. Their adaptation feels very organic, right? Because they are not foreign to the technology. And what I observe also, they don't perceive state borders like maybe the older generation, because maybe someone, young people, young person in Manila see the news in Jakarta, there's a protest or like student movement, then they feel it. This is so close to me. The proximity is closer because I see it on the palm of my hand. While people in the past, perhaps they use television, then there's a bit distant, right? So I think I'm not sure, but it could kind of definitely explain why this trends kind of spreading also because of technology. Very interesting. Dr. Cleo, we come to the last question. As an academics, as someone who's been studying and working on this topic of participatory democracy, could you maybe propose 3 practical steps to strengthen the participatory democracy in Southeast Asia? We are experiencing this backsliding, but could you maybe recommend 3 practical steps? What could we do?
Well, I work a lot on elections, right? And I have to say that even though elections matter, it's not the only thing, it's not the only avenue for participation. So that's one thing. It's an initial avenue for participation, but it's not the only thing. Two is to rely on the rich history as well. I think it's important to also look back to see how our societies have pushed back before. And also, the third is to harness the power of the digital space, because it's one way to hold people accountable, right? It's to expose these things, and I think it's a good way to use the tool, the digital tool, which is to be more aware of the kinds of abuses that are happening there. I mean, let's think about in both scenarios where in 2 countries in Southeast Asia, the exposing the lifestyle of public officials that clearly shows that there's an abuse of power and state resources.
And their families and their kids, yeah?
Yeah. And so what happened there was they were able to go around the institutional limitations that have been placed to minimize transparency. And yet social media was able to expose that effectively and efficiently, that it generated strong response. So, we can really harness the power of the digital instruments that we have and the digital environments that we have to demand for accountability. I think what's important is not to settle for the status quo, because young people know what is due them. Well, everyone does, right? All citizens know what is due them. And it's time to really hold our public officials accountable for the kinds of public services that we expect, but is not being delivered to us.
And any last word on democracy? What is your hope for democracy in Southeast Asia?
Well, so hard to be hopeful when you see, for instance, for us in the Philippines, seeing the magnitude of corruption that we're seeing. I think we're in a critical juncture, and it should really be a combination of it should be a partnership between those in power and citizens. And we all have to have this long-term vision of what we really want for both the state and society that we're in. I think the levels of corruption that we're seeing just shows the kind of short-term vision that some people in power have. What we need is to arrive at a level of conversation and consensus about the long-term goals that we want for both state and society, for our country. I think it's important to have that. Political elites need to listen and converse with the public, and the public also needs to be able to articulate effectively and efficiently their demands, including demands for accountability.
Thank you so much, Prof. Cleo, maraming salamat po for speaking us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, for speaking to us today, and for sharing your valuable insight with our audience. And audience, don't forget her latest paper. Personally, I learned a lot from the paper. And stay tuned for the next episode of Böll Talks, Dialogues and Insight from Southeast Asia, where we continue exploring the ideas, people, and stories driving change across Southeast Asia. Thank you.